At all events, if I am right, I thought to myself, I must certainly find some remains of primitive plants, and it will be absolutely necessary to give way to such indubitable evidence. Let us have a good search. I accordingly lost no opportunity of searching, and had not gone more than about 100 yards, when the evidence I sought for cropped up in the most incontestable manner before my eyes. It was quite natural that I should expect to find these signs, for during the Silurian period the seas contained no fewer than 1,500 different animal and vegetable species. My feet, so long accustomed to the hard and arid lava soil, suddenly found themselves treading on a kind of soft dust, the remains of plants and shells. Upon the walls themselves, I could clearly make out the outline, as plain as a sun picture, of the fucus and the lycopods. The worthy and excellent Professor Hardwigg could not, of course, make any mistake about the matter, but I believe he deliberately closed his eyes and continued on his way with a firm and unalterable step. I began to think that he was carrying his obstinacy a great deal too far. I could no longer act with prudence or composure. I stooped on a sudden and picked up an almost perfect shell, which had undoubtedly belonged to some animal very much resembling some of the present day. Having secured the prize, I followed in the wake of my uncle. "Do you see this?" I said. "Well," said the professor, with the most imperturbable tranquillity, "it is the shell of a crustaceous animal of the extinct order of the trilobites. Nothing more, I assure you." "But," cried I, much troubled at his coolness, "do you draw no conclusion from it?" "Well, if I may ask, what conclusion do you draw from it yourself?" "Well, I thought—" "I know, my boy, what you would say, and you are right, perfectly and incontestably right. We have finally abandoned the crust of lava and the road by which the lava ascended. It is quite possible that I may have been mistaken, but I shall be unable to discover my error until I get to the end of this gallery." "You are quite right as far as that is concerned," I replied, "and I should highly approve of your decision if we had not to fear the greatest of all dangers." "And what is that?" "Want of water." "Well, my dear Henry, it can't be helped. We must put ourselves on rations." And on he went. Chapter 17. Deeper and deeper, the coal mines. In truth, we were compelled to put ourselves upon rations. Our supply would certainly last not more than 3 days. I found this out about supper time. The worst part of the matter was that, in what is called the transition rocks, it was hardly to be expected we should meet with water. I had read of the horrors of thirst, and I knew that where we were, a brief trial of its sufferings would put an end to our adventures and our lives. But it was utterly useless to discuss the matter with my uncle. He would have answered by some axiom from Plato. During the whole of next day, we proceeded on our journey through this interminable gallery, arch after arch, tunnel after tunnel. We journeyed without exchanging a word. We had become as mute and reticent as Hans, our guide. The road had no longer an upward tendency. At all events, if it had, it was not to be made out very clearly. Sometimes there could be no doubt that we were going downwards. But this inclination was scarcely to be distinguished, and was by no means reassuring to the professor, because the character of the strata was in no wise modified, and the transition character of the rocks became more and more marked. It was a glorious sight to see how the electric light brought out the sparkles in the walls of the calcareous rocks and the old red sandstone. One might have fancied oneself in one of those deep cuttings in Devonshire, which have given their name to this kind of soil. Some magnificent specimens of marble projected from the sides of the gallery, some of an agate gray with white veins of variegated character, others of a yellow spotted color with red veins. Farther off might be seen samples of color in which cherry-tinted seams were to be found in all their brightest shades. The greater number of these marbles were stamped with the marks of primitive animals. Since the previous evening, nature and creation had made considerable progress. Instead of the rudimentary trilobites, I perceived the remains of a more perfect order. Among others, the fish in which the eye of a geologist has been able to discover the first form of the reptile. The Devonian seas were inhabited by a vast number of animals of this species, which were deposited in tens of thousands in the rocks of new formation. It was quite evident to me that we were ascending the scale of animal life of which man forms the summit. My excellent uncle, the professor, appeared not to take notice of these warnings. He was determined at any risk to proceed. He must have been in expectation of one of two things, either that a vertical well was about to open under his feet, and thus allow him to continue his descent, or that some insurmountable obstacle would compel us to stop and go back by the road we had so long traveled. But evening came again, and to my horror, neither hope was doomed to be realized. On Friday, after a night when I began to feel the gnawing agony of thirst, and when in consequence appetite decreased, our little band rose and once more followed the turnings and windings, the ascents and descents of this interminable gallery. All was silent and gloomy. I could see that even my uncle had ventured too far. After about 10 hours of further progress, a progress dull and monotonous to the last degree, I remarked that the reverberation and reflection of our lamps upon the sides of the tunnel had singularly diminished. The marble, the schist, the calcareous rocks, the red sandstone had disappeared, leaving in their places a dark and gloomy wall, somber and without brightness. When we reached a remarkably narrow part of the tunnel, I leaned my left hand against the rock. When I took my hand away and happened to glance at it, it was quite black. We had reached the coal strata of the central earth. "A coal mine," I cried. "A coal mine without miners," responded my uncle a little severely. "How can we tell?" "I can tell," replied my uncle in a sharp and doctorial tone. "I am perfectly certain that this gallery through successive layers of coal was not cut by the hand of man, but whether it is the work of nature or not is of little concern to us. The hour for our evening meal has come, let us sup." Hans, the guide, occupied himself in preparing food. I had come to that point when I could no longer eat. All I cared about were the few drops of water which fell to my share. What I suffered it is useless to record. The guide's gourd, not quite half full, was all that was left for us three. Having finished their repast, my two companions laid themselves down upon their rugs and found in sleep a remedy for their fatigue and sufferings. As for me, I could not sleep. I lay counting the hours until morning. The next morning, Saturday, at 6 o'clock, we started again. 20 minutes later, we suddenly came upon a vast excavation. From its mighty extent, I saw at once that the hand of man could have had nothing to do with this coal mine. The vault above would have fallen in. As it was only held together by some miracle of nature. This mighty natural cavern was about 100 feet wide by about 150 high. The earth had evidently been cast apart by some violent subterranean commotion. The mass, giving way to some prodigious upheaving of nature, had split in two, leaving the vast gap into which we inhabitants of the earth had penetrated for the first time. The whole singular history of the coal period was written on those dark and gloomy walls. A geologist would have been able easily to follow the different phases of its formation. The seams of coal were separated by strata of sandstone, a compact clay, which appeared to be crushed down by the weight from above. At that period of the world, which preceded the secondary epoch, the earth was covered by a coating of enormous and rich vegetation, due to the double action of tropical heat and perpetual humidity. A vast atmospheric cloud of vapor surrounded the earth on all sides, preventing the rays of the sun from ever reaching it. Hence the conclusion that these intense heats did not arise from this new source of caloric. Perhaps even the star of day was not quite ready for its brilliant work to illumine a universe. Climates did not as yet exist, and a level heat pervaded the whole surface of the globe, the same heat existing at the North Pole as at the equator. Whence did it come? From the interior of the earth. In spite of all the learned theories of Professor Hardwigg, a fierce and vehement fire certainly burned within the entrails of the great spheroid. Its action was felt even to the very topmost crust of the earth. The plants then in existence, being deprived of the vivifying rays of the sun, had neither buds, nor flowers, nor odor, but their roots drew a strong and vigorous life from the burning earth of early days. There were but few of what may be called trees, only herbaceous plants, immense turfs, briars, mosses, rare families, which, however, in those days were counted by tens and tens of thousands. It is entirely to this exuberant vegetation that coal owes its origin. The crust of the vast globe still yielded under the influence of the seething, boiling mass, which was forever at work beneath. Hence arose numerous fissures and continual falling in of the upper earth. The dense mass of plants being beneath the waters soon formed themselves into vast agglomerations. Then came about the action of natural chemistry. In the depths of the ocean, the vegetable mass at first became turf. Then, thanks to the influence of gases and subterranean fermentation, they underwent the complete process of mineralization. In this manner, in early days, were formed those vast and prodigious layers of coal, which in ever-increasing consumption must utterly use up in about 3 centuries more, if people do not find some more economic light than gas, and some cheaper motive power than steam. All these reflections, the memories of my school studies, came to my mind while I gazed upon these mighty accumulations of coal, whose riches, however, are scarcely likely to be ever utilized. The working of these mines could only be carried out at an expense that would never yield a profit. The matter, however, is scarcely worthy consideration when coal is scattered over the whole surface of the globe within a few yards of the upper crust. As I looked at these untouched strata, therefore, I knew they would remain as long as the world lasts. While we still continued our journey, I alone forgot the length of the road by giving myself up wholly to these geological considerations. The temperature continued to be very much the same as while we were traveling amid the lava and the schists. On the other hand, my sense of smell was much affected by a very powerful odor. I immediately knew that the gallery was filled to overflowing with that dangerous gas the miners call fire damp, the explosion of which has caused such fearful and terrible accidents, making 100 widows and hundreds of orphans in a single hour. Happily, we were able to illumine our progress by means of the Ruhmkorff apparatus. If we had been so rash and imprudent as to explore this gallery, torch in hand, a terrible explosion would have put an end to our travels, simply because no travelers would be left. Our excursion through this wondrous coal mine in the very bowels of the earth lasted until evening. My uncle was scarcely able to conceal his impatience and dissatisfaction at the road, continuing still to advance in a horizontal direction. The darkness, dense and opaque a few yards in advance and in the rear, rendered it impossible to make out what was the length of the gallery. For myself, I began to believe that it was simply interminable and would go on in the same manner for months. Suddenly, at 6 o'clock, we stood in front of a wall. To the right, to the left, above, below, nowhere was there any passage. We had reached a spot where the rock said in unmistakable accents, "No thoroughfare." I stood stupefied. The guide simply folded his arms. My uncle was silent. "Well, well, so much the better," cried my uncle at last. "I now know what we are about. We are decidedly not upon the road followed by Saknussemm. All we have to do is to go back. Let us take one night's good rest, and before 3 days are over, I promise you we shall have regained the point where the galleries divided." "Yes, we may, if our strength lasts as long," I cried in a lamentable voice. "And why not? Tomorrow, among us 3, there will not be a drop of water. It is just gone." "And your courage with it," said my uncle, speaking in a severe tone. What could I say? I turned round on my side, and from sheer exhaustion fell into a heavy sleep disturbed by dreams of water, and I awoke unrefreshed. I would have bartered a diamond mine for a glass of pure spring water. Chapter 18. The Wrong Road. Next day our departure took place at a very early hour. There was no time for the least delay. According to my account, we had 5 days' hard work to get back to the place where the galleries divided. I can never tell all the sufferings we endured upon our return. My uncle bore them like a man who has been in the wrong, that is, with concentrated and suppressed anger, hands, with all the resignation of his pacific character, and I confess that I did nothing but complain and despair. I had no heart for this bad fortune. But there was one consolation. Defeat at the outset would probably upset the whole journey. As I had expected from the first, our supply of water gave completely out on our first day's march. Our provision of liquids was reduced to our supply of skedum, but this horrible, nay, I will say it, this infernal liquor burnt the throat, and I could not even bear the sight of it. I found the temperature to be stifling. I was paralyzed with fatigue. More than once I was about to fall insensible to the ground. The whole party then halted, and the worthy Icelander and my excellent uncle did their best to console and comfort me. I could, however, plainly see that my uncle was contending painfully against the extreme fatigues of our journey and the awful torture generated by the absence of water. At length a time came when I ceased to recollect anything, when all was one awful, hideous, fantastic dream. At last, on Tuesday, the 7th of the month of July, after crawling on our hands and knees for many hours, more dead than alive, we reached the point of junction between the galleries. I lay like a log, an inert mass of human flesh on the arid lava soil. It was then 10 in the morning. Hans and my uncle, leaning against the wall, tried to nibble away at some pieces of biscuit, while deep groans and sighs escaped from my scorched and swollen lips. Then I fell off into a kind of deep lethargy. Presently I felt my uncle approach and lift me up tenderly in his arms. "Poor boy," I heard him say in a tone of deep commiseration. I was profoundly touched by these words, being by no means accustomed to signs of womanly weakness in the professor. I caught his trembling hands in mine and gave them a gentle pressure. He allowed me to do so without resistance, looking at me kindly all the time. His eyes were wet with tears. I then saw him take the gourd which he wore at his side. To my surprise, or rather to my stupefaction, he placed it to my lips. "Drink, my boy," he said. Was it possible my ears had not deceived me? Was my uncle mad? I looked at him with, I am sure, quite an idiotic expression. I could not believe him. I too much feared the counteraction of disappointment. "Drink," he said again. Had I heard aright? Before, however, I could ask myself the question a second time, a mouthful of water cooled my parched lips and throat. One mouthful, but I do believe it brought me back to life. I thanked my uncle by clasping my hands. My heart was too full to speak. "Yes," said he, "one mouthful of water, the very last. Do you hear, my boy, the very last? I have taken care of it at the bottom of my bottle as the apple of my eye. 20 times, 100 times, I have resisted the fearful desire to drink it. But no, no, Harry, I saved it for you." "My dear uncle," I exclaimed, and the big tears rolled down my hot and feverish cheeks. "Yes, my poor boy, I knew that when you reached this place, this crossroad in the earth, you would fall down half dead, and I saved my last drop of water in order to restore you." "Thanks," I cried, "thanks from my heart." As little as my thirst was really quenched, I had nevertheless partially recovered my strength. The contracted muscles of my throat relaxed, and the inflammation of my lips in some measure subsided. At all events, I was able to speak. "Well," I said, "there can be no doubt now as to what we have to do. Water has utterly failed us. Our journey is therefore at an end. Let us return." While I spoke thus, my uncle evidently avoided my face. He held down his head. His eyes were turned in every possible direction but the right one. "Yes," I continued, getting excited by my own words, "we must go back to Sneffels. May heaven give us strength to enable us once more to revisit the light of day. Would that we now stood on the summit of the crater." "Go back," said my uncle, speaking to himself, "and must it be so?" "Go back, yes," and without losing a single moment, I vehemently cried. For some moments, there was silence under that dark and gloomy vault. "So, my dear Harry," said the professor in a very singular tone of voice, "those few drops of water have not sufficed to restore your energy and courage. Courage, I cried. I see that you are quite as downcast as before, and still give way to discouragement and despair. What then was the man made of, and what other projects were entering his fertile and audacious brain? You are not discouraged, sir. What, give up just as we are on the verge of success? He cried. Never, never shall it be said that Professor Hardwigg retreated. Then we must make up our minds to perish, I cried with a helpless sigh. No, Harry, my boy, certainly not. Go, leave me, I am very far from desiring your death. Take hands with you, I will go on alone. You ask us to leave you. Leave me, I say. I have undertaken this dangerous and perilous adventure. I will carry it to the end, or I will never return to the surface of Mother Earth. Go, Harry, once more I say to you, go. My uncle, as he spoke, was terribly excited. His voice, which before had been tender, almost womanly, became harsh and menacing. He appeared to be struggling with desperate energy against the impossible. I did not wish to abandon him at the bottom of that abyss, while, on the other hand, the instinct of preservation told me to fly. Meanwhile, our guide was looking on with profound calmness and indifference. He appeared to be an unconcerned party, and yet he perfectly well knew what was going on between us. Our gestures sufficiently indicated the different roads each wished to follow, and which each tried to influence the other to undertake. But Hans appeared not to take the slightest interest in what was really a question of life and death for us all, but waited quite ready to obey the signal which should say go aloft, or to resume his desperate journey into the interior of the earth. How then I wished with all my heart and soul that I could make him understand my words, my representations, my sighs and groans, the earnest accents in which I should have spoken would have convinced that cold, hard nature. Those fearful dangers and perils of which the stolid guide had no idea, I would have pointed them out to him. I would have, as it were, made him see and feel. Between us, we might have convinced the obstinate professor. If the worst had come to the worst, we could have compelled him to return to the summit of Sneffels. I quietly approached Hans. I caught his hand in mine. He never moved a muscle. I indicated to him the road to the top of the crater. He remained motionless. My panting form, my haggard countenance must have indicated the extent of my sufferings. The Icelander gently shook his head and pointed to my uncle. "Master," he said. "The word is Icelandic as well as English." "The master," I cried, beside myself with fury. "Madman, no, I tell you he is not the master of our lives. We must fly. We must drag him with us. Do you hear me? Do you understand me, I say?" I have already explained that I held Hans by the arm. I tried to make him rise from his seat. I struggled with him and tried to force him away. My uncle now interposed. "My good Henry, be calm," he said. "You will obtain nothing from my devoted follower, therefore listen to what I have to say." I folded my arms as well as I could and looked my uncle full in the face. "This wretched want of water," he said, "is the sole obstacle to the success of my project. In the entire gallery, made of lava, schist, and coal, it is true we found not one liquid molecule. It is quite possible that we may be more fortunate in the western tunnel." My sole reply was to shake my head with an air of deep incredulity. "Listen to me to the end," said the professor in his well-known lecturing voice. "While you lay yonder without life or motion, I undertook a reconnoitering journey into the conformation of this other gallery. I have discovered that it goes directly downwards into the bowels of the earth, and in a few hours will take us to the old granitic formation. In this, we shall undoubtedly find innumerable springs. The nature of the rock makes this a mathematical certainty, and instinct agrees with logic to say that it is so. Now, this is the serious proposition which I have to make to you. When Christopher Columbus asked of his men 3 days to discover the land of promise, his men, ill, terrified, and hopeless, yet gave him 3 days, and the New World was discovered. Now I, the Christopher Columbus of this subterranean region, only ask of you 1 more day. If when that time is expired, I have not found the water of which we are in search, I swear to you, I will give up my mighty enterprise and return to the earth's surface." Despite my irritation and despair, I knew how much it cost my uncle to make this proposition and to hold such conciliatory language. Under the circumstances, what could I do but yield? "Well," I cried, "let it be as you wish, and may heaven reward your superhuman energy. But unless we discover water, our hours are numbered, let us lose no time, but go ahead." Chapter 19. The Western Gallery, a New Route. Our descent was now resumed by means of the second gallery. Hans took up his post in front as usual. We had not gone more than 100 yards when the professor carefully examined the walls. "This is the primitive formation. We are on the right road. Onwards is our hope." When the whole earth got cool in the first hours of the world's morning, the diminution of the volume of the earth produced a state of dislocation in its upper crust, followed by ruptures, crevasses, and fissures. The passage was a fissure of this kind, through which, ages ago, had flowed the eruptive granite. The thousand windings and turnings formed an inextricable labyrinth through the ancient soil. As we descended, successions of layers composing the primitive soil appeared with the utmost fidelity of detail. Geological science considers this primitive soil as the base of the mineral crust, and it has recognized that it is composed of 3 different strata or layers, all resting on the immovable rock known as granite. No mineralogists had even found themselves placed in such a marvelous position to study nature in all her real and naked beauty. The sounding rod, a mere machine, could not bring to the surface of the earth the objects of value for the study of its internal structure, which we were about to see with our own eyes, to touch with our own hands. Remember that I am writing this after the journey. Across the streak of the rocks, colored by beautiful green tints, wound metallic threads of copper, of manganese, with traces of platinum and gold. I could not help gazing at these riches buried in the entrails of Mother Earth, and of which no man would have the enjoyment to the end of time. These treasures, mighty and inexhaustible, were buried in the morning of the earth's history, at such awful depths that no crowbar or pickaxe will ever drag them from their tomb. The light of our Ruhmkorff's coil, increased tenfold by the myriad of prismatic masses of rock, sent its jets of fire in every direction, and I could fancy myself traveling through a huge hollow diamond, the rays of which produced myriads of extraordinary effects. Towards 6 o'clock, this festival of light began sensibly and visibly to decrease, and soon almost ceased. The sides of the gallery assumed a crystallized tint, with a somber hue. White mica began to commingle more freely with feldspar and quartz, to form what may be called the true rock, the stone which is hard above all, that supports, without being crushed, the 4 stories of the earth's soil. We were walled by an immense prison of granite. It was now 8 o'clock, and still there was no sign of water. The sufferings I endured were horrible. My uncle now kept at the head of our little column. Nothing could induce him to stop. I, meanwhile, had but one real thought. My ear was keenly on the watch to catch the sound of a spring, but no pleasant sound of falling water fell upon my listening ear. But at last the time came when my limbs refused to carry me longer. I contended heroically against the terrible tortures I endured, because I did not wish to compel my uncle to halt. To him, I knew this would be the last fatal stroke. Suddenly I felt a deadly faintness come over me. My eyes could no longer see, my knees shook. I gave one despairing cry and fell. "Help, help, I am dying." My uncle turned and slowly retraced his steps. He looked at me with folded arms and then allowed one sentence to escape in hollow accents from his lips. "All is over." The last thing I saw was a face fearfully distorted with pain and sorrow, and then my eyes closed. When I again opened them, I saw my companions lying near me, motionless, wrapped in their huge traveling rugs. Were they asleep or dead? For myself, sleep was wholly out of the question. My fainting fit over, I was wakeful as the lark. I suffered too much for sleep to visit my eyelids, the more that I thought myself sick unto death, dying. The last words spoken by my uncle seemed to be buzzing in my ears, "All is over," and it was probable that he was right. In the state of prostration to which I was reduced, it was madness to think of ever again seeing the light of day. Above were miles upon miles of the earth's crust. As I thought of it, I could fancy the whole weight resting on my shoulders. I was crushed, annihilated, and exhausted myself in vain attempts to turn in my granite bed. Hours upon hours passed away. A profound and terrible silence reigned around us, a silence of the tomb. Nothing could make itself heard through these gigantic walls of granite. The very thought was stupendous. Presently, despite my apathy, despite the kind of deadly calm into which I was cast, something aroused me. It was a slight but peculiar noise. While I was watching intently, I observed that the tunnel was becoming dark. Then, gazing through the dim light that remained, I thought I saw the Icelander taking his departure, lamp in hand. Why had he acted thus? Did Hans the guide mean to abandon us? My uncle lay fast asleep or dead. I tried to cry out and arouse him. My voice, feebly issuing from my parched and fevered lips, found no echo in that fearful place. My throat was dry, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. The obscurity had by this time become intense, and at last even the faint sound of the guide's footsteps was lost in the blank distance. My soul seemed filled with anguish, and death appeared welcome, only let it come quickly. "Hans is leaving us," I cried. "Hans, Hans, if you are a man, come back." These words were spoken to myself. They could not be heard aloud. Nevertheless, after the first few moments of terror were over, I was ashamed of my suspicions against a man who hitherto had behaved so admirably. Nothing in his conduct or character justified suspicion. Moreover, a moment's reflection reassured me. His departure could not be a flight. Instead of ascending the gallery, he was going deeper down into the gulf. Had he had any bad design, his way would have been upwards. This reasoning calmed me a little, and I began to hope. The good and peaceful and imperturbable Hans would certainly not have arisen from his sleep without some serious and grave motive. Was he bent on a voyage of discovery? During the deep, still silence of the night, had he at last heard that sweet murmur about which we were all so anxious? Chapter 20. Water, where is it? A bitter disappointment. During a long, weary hour, there crossed my wildly delirious brain all sorts of reasons as to what could have aroused our quiet and faithful guide. The most absurd and ridiculous ideas passed through my head, each more impossible than the other. I believe I was either half or wholly mad. Suddenly, however, there arose, as it were from the depths of the earth, a voice of comfort. It was the sound of footsteps. Hans was returning. Presently, the uncertain light began to shine upon the walls of the passage, and then it came in view far down the sloping tunnel. At length, Hans himself appeared. He approached my uncle, placed his hand upon his shoulder, and gently awakened him. My uncle, as soon as he saw who it was, instantly arose. "Well," exclaimed the professor. "Vatten," said the hunter. I did not know a single word of the Danish language, and yet, by a sort of mysterious instinct, I understood what the guide had said. "Water, water," I cried in a wild and frantic tone, clapping my hands and gesticulating like a madman. "Water," murmured my uncle in a voice of deep emotion and gratitude. "Hvar, where?" "Nedat, below." Where below? I understood every word. I had caught the hunter by the hands, and I shook them heartily while he looked on with perfect calmness. The preparations for our departure did not take long, and we were soon making a rapid descent into the tunnel. An hour later, we had advanced 1,000 yards and descended 2,000 feet. At this moment, I heard an accustomed and well-known sound running along the floors of the granite rock, a kind of dull and sullen roar, like that of a distant waterfall. During the first half-hour of our advance, not finding the discovered spring, my feelings of intense suffering appeared to return. Once more, I began to lose all hope. My uncle, however, observing how downhearted I was again becoming, took up the conversation. "Hans was right," he exclaimed enthusiastically. "That is the dull roaring of a torrent." "A torrent," I cried, delighted at even hearing the welcome words. "There's not the slightest doubt about it," he replied. "A subterranean river is flowing beside us." I made no reply, but hastened on, once more animated by hope. I began not even to feel the deep fatigue which hitherto had overpowered me. The very sound of this glorious murmuring water already refreshed me. We could hear it increasing in volume every moment. The torrent, which for a long time could be heard flowing over our heads, now ran distinctly along the left wall, roaring, rushing, spluttering, and still falling. Several times I passed my hand across the rock hoping to find some trace of humidity, of the slightest percolation. Alas, in vain. Again a half-hour passed in the same weary toil. Again we advanced. It now became evident that the hunter, during his absence, had not been able to carry his researches any farther. Guided by an instinct peculiar to the dwellers in mountain regions and water-finders, he smelt the living spring through the rock. Still, he had not seen the precious liquid. He had neither quenched his own thirst, nor brought us one drop in his gourd. Moreover, we soon made the disastrous discovery that if our progress continued, we should soon be moving away from the torrent, the sound of which gradually diminished. We turned back. Hans halted at the precise spot where the sound of the torrent appeared nearest. I could bear the suspense and suffering no longer, and seated myself against the wall, behind which I could hear the water seething and effervescing not 2 feet away. But a solid wall of granite still separated us from it. Hans looked keenly at me, and strange enough, for once I thought I saw a smile on his imperturbable face. He rose from a stone on which he had been seated and took up the lamp. I could not help rising and following. He moved slowly along the firm and solid granite wall. I watched him with mingled curiosity and eagerness. Presently he halted and placed his ear against the dry stone, moving slowly along and listening with the most extreme care and attention. I understood at once that he was searching for the exact spot where the torrent's roar was most plainly heard. This point he soon found in the lateral wall on the left side, about 3 feet above the level of the tunnel floor. I was in a state of intense excitement. I scarcely dared believe what the eiderduck hunter was about to do. It was, however, impossible in a moment more not to both understand and applaud, and even to smother him in my embraces, when I saw him raise the heavy crowbar and commence an attack upon the rock itself. "Saved!" I cried. "Yes," cried my uncle, even more excited and delighted than myself. "Hans is quite right. Oh, the worthy, excellent man, we should never have thought of such an idea. And nobody else, I think, would have done so. Such a process, simple as it seemed, would most certainly not have entered our heads. Nothing could be more dangerous than to begin to work with pickaxes in that particular part of the globe. Supposing, while he was at work, a break-up were to take place, and supposing the torrent, once having gained an inch, were to take an ell, and come pouring bodily through the broken rock. Not one of these dangers was chimerical. They were only too real. But at that moment, no fear of falling in of the roof, or even of inundation, was capable of stopping us. Our thirst was so intense that to quench it we would have dug below the bed of old ocean itself. Hans went quietly to work, a work which neither my uncle nor I would have undertaken at any price. Our impatience was so great that if we had once begun with pickaxe and crowbar, the rock would soon have split into 100 fragments. The guide, on the contrary, calm, ready, moderate, wore away the hard rock by little steady blows of his instrument, making no attempt at a larger hole than about 6 inches. As I stood, I heard, or I thought I heard, the roar of the torrent momentarily increasing in loudness, and at times I almost felt the pleasant sensation of water upon my parched lips. At the end of what appeared an age, Hans had made a hole which enabled his crowbar to enter 2 feet into the solid rock. He had been at work exactly an hour. It appeared a dozen. I was getting wild with impatience. My uncle began to think of using more violent measures. I had the greatest difficulty in checking him. He had indeed just got hold of his crowbar when a loud and welcome hiss was heard. Then a stream, or rather jet, of water burst through the wall and came out with such force as to hit the opposite side. Hans, the guide, who was half upset by the shock, was scarcely able to keep down a cry of pain and grief. I understood his meaning when, plunging my hands into the sparkling jet, I myself gave a wild and frantic cry. The water was scalding hot. Boiling, I cried, in bitter disappointment. "Well, never mind," said my uncle, "it will soon get cool." The tunnel began to be filled by clouds of vapor, while a small stream ran away into the interior of the earth. In a short time, we had some sufficiently cool to drink. We swallowed it in huge mouthfuls. Oh, what exalted delight! What rich and incomparable luxury! What was this water? Whence did it come? To us, what was that? The simple fact was, it was water, and though still with a tingle of warmth about it, it brought back to the heart that life which, but for it, must surely have faded away. I drank greedily, almost without tasting it. When, however, I had almost quenched my ravenous thirst, I made a discovery. "Why, it is chalybeate water." "A most excellent stomachic," replied my uncle, "and highly mineralized. Here is a journey worth 20 to Spa." "It's very good," I replied. "I should think so. Water found 6 miles underground. There is a peculiarly inky flavor about it, which is by no means disagreeable. Hans may congratulate himself on having made a rare discovery. What do you say, nephew, according to the usual custom of travelers, to name the stream after him?" "Good," said I, and the name of Hansbach, Hans Brook, was at once agreed upon. Hans was not a bit more proud after hearing our determination than he was before. After having taken a very small modicum of the welcome refreshment, he had seated himself in a corner with his usual imperturbable gravity. "Now," said I, "it is not worth while letting this water run to waste." "What is the use?" replied my uncle. "The source from which this river rises is inexhaustible." "Never mind," I continued. "Let us fill our goatskin and gourds, and then try to stop the opening up." My advice, after some hesitation, was followed or attempted to be followed. Hans picked up all the broken pieces of granite he had knocked out, and using some tow he happened to have about him, tried to shut up the fissure he had made in the wall. All he did was to scald his hands. The pressure was too great, and all our attempts were utter failures. "It is evident," I remarked, "that the upper surface of these springs is situated at a very great height above, as we may fairly infer from the great pressure of the jet." "That is by no means doubtful," replied my uncle. "If this column of water is about 32,000 feet high, the atmospheric pressure must be something enormous. But a new idea has just struck me." "And what is that?" "Why be at so much trouble to close this aperture?" "Because—" I hesitated and stammered, having no real reason. "When our water bottles are empty, we are not at all sure that we shall be able to fill them," observed my uncle. "I think that is very probable." "Well then, let this water run. It will, of course, naturally follow in our track, and will serve to guide and refresh us." "I think the idea a good one," I cried in reply, "and with this rivulet as a companion, there is no further reason why we should not succeed in our marvelous project." "Ah, my boy," said the professor, laughing, "after all, you are coming round. More than that, I am now confident of ultimate success." "One moment, nephew mine. Let us begin by taking some hours of repose." I had utterly forgotten that it was night. The chronometer, however, informed me of the fact. Soon we were sufficiently restored and refreshed, and had all fallen into a profound sleep. Chapter 21. Under the Ocean. By the next day we had nearly forgotten our past sufferings. The first sensation I experienced was surprise at not being thirsty, and I actually asked myself the reason. The running stream, which flowed in rippling wavelets at my feet, was the satisfactory reply. We breakfasted with a good appetite, and then drank our fill of the excellent water. I felt myself quite a new man, ready to go anywhere my uncle chose to lead. I began to think, why should not a man as seriously convinced as my uncle succeed, with so excellent a guide as worthy Hans, and so devoted a nephew as myself? These were the brilliant ideas which now invaded my brain. Had the proposition now been made to go back to the summit of Mount Sneffels, I should have declined the offer in a most indignant manner. But fortunately, there was no question of going up. We were about to descend farther into the interior of the earth. "Let us be moving," I cried, awakening the echoes of the old world. We resumed our march on Thursday at 8 o'clock in the morning. The great granite tunnel, as it went round by sinuous and winding ways, presented every now and then sharp turns, and in fact all the appearance of a labyrinth. Its direction, however, was in general towards the southwest. My uncle made several pauses in order to consult his compass. The gallery now began to trend downwards in a horizontal direction, with about 2 inches of fall in every furlong. The murmuring stream flowed quietly at our feet. I could not but compare it to some familiar spirit guiding us through the earth, and I dabbled my fingers in its tepid water, which sang like a naiad as we progressed. My good humor began to assume a mythological character. As for my uncle, he began to complain of the horizontal character of the road. His route, he found, began to be indefinitely prolonged, instead of sliding down the celestial ray, according to his expression. But we had no choice, and as long as our road led towards the center, however little progress we made, there was no reason to complain. Moreover, from time to time the slopes were much greater, the naiad sang more loudly, and we began to dip downwards in earnest.